Briarwood Heights, South Carolina, was a town that seemed frozen in time. Rows of white picket fences lined the streets, while the towering steeple of First Baptist Church cast a long shadow over the community. To outsiders, Briarwood was idyllic, a sanctuary of faith and family values. But for Eleanor Harper, the shadows within her own life were far darker than the ones cast by the church's cross. Eleanor had grown up in this very town, under the suffocating rule of her father, Reverend Barnett. A man revered by the congregation but feared within the walls of his own home, Barnett ruled with scripture in one hand and punishment in the other. For young Eleanor, the Bible became a refuge. She pored over its verses, seeking salvation from the torment inflicted by her father's iron will and her mother's silent complicity. But those same scriptures, twisted by years of trauma, became the foundation for the woman she would later become. Now at 42, Eleanor was a pillar of the Briarwood community. Married to Edward Harper, a kind and hard-working mechanic, and mother to James, a shy and introspective 19-year-old, she presented the perfect image of a devoted Christian wife and mother. But behind her gentle smiles and Sunday school lessons lay a mind shaped by pain, fear, and a desperate need for control. The Harper household reflected the outward serenity Eleanor carefully curated. Meals began with long prayers, the walls were adorned with biblical verses, and every Sunday was spent at church. Yet, beneath the surface, tension simmered. Edward's long hours at the auto shop in Charleston meant he was often absent, leaving Eleanor to oversee James' upbringing with a fervor that bordered on obsession. James Harper had always been a quiet child, more comfortable with books than people. But as he grew older, his mother's constant attention became a burden. She scrutinized his every move, monitored his friendships, and, most recently, had insisted he complete his final year of high school at home. "The world is full of sin, James," she would say, her tone a mix of warning and sorrow. "It's my duty to protect you from it." Edward, ever trusting of his wife's judgment, dismissed her growing intensity as maternal devotion. "She's just looking out for him," he'd tell himself, ignoring the unease that occasionally crept into his thoughts. But James felt the weight of her presence at every turn. Her eyes lingered too long, her hands would rest a moment too long on his shoulder, and her praise felt suffocating. One evening in late June 2022, the Harper family sat down for dinner. The summer air was heavy with humidity, the distant chirping of cicadas filling the gaps in conversation. Eleanor led the family in prayer, her voice soft yet commanding as she thanked God for their blessings and prayed for strength to guide James along a righteous path. As Edward dug into his plate of fried chicken, he glanced at his son. James looked withdrawn, his fork pushing mashed potatoes around his plate without eating. Eleanor, ever attentive, noticed as well. "James," she said, her voice honeyed yet firm, "is something on your mind?" James hesitated, his gaze flickering to his father before returning to his plate. "No, ma'am. I'm fine." Eleanor smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "You can always talk to me, sweetheart. God put me here to guide you." Edward cleared his throat, sensing the growing discomfort. "Boy's just tired, Eleanor. He's been working hard on his studies." Eleanor nodded, but the moment lingered, thick with unspoken tension. James excused himself early, retreating to his room. As he closed the door, he let out a shaky breath. The air inside his sanctuary felt just as stifling as the dinner table. From his window, James could see the faint glow of the church steeple in the distance. A place that should have been a symbol of peace and comfort felt more like a watchtower, its gaze always fixed on him. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Edward began clearing the table while Eleanor methodically wiped the counters. Her movements were calm, deliberate, but her mind was racing. She couldn't ignore the distance growing between her and James. He was slipping away from her grasp, and that thought was unbearable. As the clock struck 10 and Edward climbed into bed, exhausted from another long day at the shop, Eleanor remained seated at the kitchen table. Her Bible lay open before her, but her eyes were unfocused, staring into the void of her thoughts. She flipped to the story of Lot and his daughters, her finger tracing the ancient words. In her mind, the tale became less about sin and more about duty, a divine obligation to preserve something sacred. In the silence of the night, Eleanor whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. God has a plan. I must trust in him. But in her heart, she knew that her plan was far more dangerous than anything written in Scripture. The Harper household began to shift in ways that were subtle but undeniable. Eleanor's grip over James tightened with every passing day, her devotion to guiding him morphing into something far more insidious. To anyone else, she remained the picture of piety, smiling at church socials, teaching Sunday school, and organizing charity drives. But behind closed doors, she was a woman consumed by an obsession she could no longer suppress. For James, life at home felt like a prison. The decision to homeschool him for his final year of high school had been presented as a protective measure. The world is full of temptations, Eleanor had said one Sunday afternoon, her tone heavy with conviction. The devil works hardest on young men your age. I can't let you fall into his grasp. At first, James had been too timid to argue. He trusted his mother's wisdom, even if he didn't fully understand it. But as the weeks wore on, her control became suffocating. Every hour of his day was meticulously scheduled, prayer sessions, Bible studies, and lessons that often veered into Eleanor's own interpretations of Scripture. His few remaining friends from school stopped texting, he was no longer allowed to see them. The isolation weighed on him, and Eleanor's watchful gaze never faltered. She scrutinized his every move, her presence a constant shadow. Even in moments meant for privacy, she seemed to linger nearby. One evening in early July, as James emerged from the bathroom, steam still clinging to his skin, he found Eleanor standing in the hallway. She held a laundry basket, but her eyes seemed fixed on him for a moment too long. You forgot to hang your towel, sweetheart, she said softly, her voice calm but oddly measured. James froze, clutching the towel around his waist. I was going to, sorry, I'll do it now. Eleanor smiled, her gaze lingering before she turned and walked away. James exhaled deeply, his heart pounding. Something about the exchange left him unsettled, though he couldn't quite articulate why. In the kitchen, Edward was oblivious to the growing tension. His long hours at the auto shop in Charleston meant he was often too tired to notice the subtleties of his wife's behavior. When he did sense Eleanor's intensity toward their son, he dismissed it as maternal overprotection. She's just looking out for him, Edward reassured himself one night as he poured a glass of water. But deep down, a small voice whispered doubts he couldn't quite ignore. One Saturday afternoon, the cracks in their family dynamic became harder to ignore. Eleanor was preparing lunch, humming a hymn as she sliced vegetables. Edward, taking a rare day off, sat at the table reading the paper, while James quietly scrolled through his phone. James, Eleanor said suddenly, her tone sharp. What are you looking at? Startled, James glanced up. Nothing, just a text from a friend. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. I thought we agreed you'd stay focused on your studies and avoid distractions. It's just one text, James muttered, his frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Eleanor, Edward interjected, lowering his paper. Let the boy be. He's not doing anything wrong. Eleanor's smile was tight, her knuckles white as she gripped the knife. Edward, I'm only trying to protect our son. You know how easily young men can be led astray. James stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I'm not a child, Mom. You can't control everything I do. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Eleanor's eyes bore into James, a mix of hurt and something darker flashing across her face. James, she said, her voice low and trembling, everything I do is for you. For your soul. One day, you'll understand that. Without another word, James left the room, retreating to the sanctuary of his bedroom. Edward sighed, folding his paper and rubbing his temples. "Eleanor," he began cautiously, "don't you think you're being a little intense with him? He's 19, not 9. Her expression hardened, the soft veneer of her piety cracking just slightly. "Edward, if you spent more time at home, you'd understand what I'm doing. The devil is patient, but I won't let him take our son." Edward wanted to argue, but the exhaustion of years spent avoiding conflict with his wife weighed him down. He stood and walked out to the porch, leaving Eleanor alone in the kitchen. Upstairs, James sat on the edge of his bed, his hands shaking. He felt trapped, his mother's words echoing in his head. It wasn't just the control, it was the way she looked at him now, the way her touch lingered a little too long on his arm, the way her voice softened when she spoke to him in private. He couldn't talk to his father, Edward was too distant, too wrapped up in work. And there was no one else, no friends, no teachers, no one who might notice the changes in his life. The faint sound of Eleanor's hymn drifted upstairs, a haunting melody that sent a chill down his spine. For the first time, James allowed himself to wonder, what if this isn't normal? What if something is deeply, terribly wrong? In the days that followed, the tension in the Harper household grew unbearable. Eleanor's eyes seemed to follow James wherever he went, her presence inescapable. Edward began coming home earlier from work, sensing that something was off but unable to pinpoint the source. The cracks in their family were widening, and beneath them lay a darkness that none of them could yet fathom. By mid-July, the Harper household had become a powder keg, with tension building between Eleanor and James to an unbearable level. Each day felt heavier than the last, as if the walls themselves were closing in on them. For Eleanor, this was a divine trial, a test of her faith and resolve. For James, it was a nightmare he couldn't wake from. Eleanor's behavior had shifted from overbearing to outright invasive. Her once loving gaze now felt like a prison, her touch no longer comforting but suffocating. She had taken to lingering in James' doorway at night, her silhouette outlined by the dim hallway light. "James," she whispered one evening, her voice soft but insistent. "Are you awake?" James, lying rigid in bed, feigned sleep, his breaths shallow and measured. But Eleanor stepped into the room anyway, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. She approached his bed, sitting on the edge. "I know you're awake, sweetheart," she murmured. Her hand rested on his shoulder, and James flinched under her touch. "Mom, it's late," he said, his voice shaking. "You should go to bed." Eleanor leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I've been praying for you, James. God has shown me something special, something only we can understand." James turned away, pulling the blanket tighter around himself. His pulse raced, panic clawing at his chest. Eleanor lingered for a moment longer before finally standing and leaving the room. As the door clicked shut behind her, James sat up, his breaths shallow and ragged. He wanted to run, to scream, to do anything to escape the oppressive atmosphere that seemed to suffocate him. But where could he go? Who would believe him if he tried to explain the growing madness in his own home? The next day, Eleanor's intensity only grew. During one of their Bible study sessions, she flipped to the story of Lot and his daughters, her voice tinged with reverence as she read aloud. "This story is often misunderstood," she said, her eyes fixed on James. "But when you look deeper, you see the truth. Sometimes, God asks us to do things that others might not understand. Things that are difficult but necessary." James swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edges of the table. "That's not what this story means," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Eleanor smiled, a sad and almost pitying expression. "You're young, James. You'll understand one day." Edward, meanwhile, began to notice the growing tension but was unsure how to address it. Coming home earlier from work one evening, he found James sitting alone on the porch, staring blankly at the setting sun. "Hey, bud," Edward said, pulling up a chair beside him. "What's on your mind?" James hesitated, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. He wanted to tell his father everything, the late-night whispers, the lingering touches, the stories from the Bible twisted into something dark and incomprehensible. But the words wouldn't come. "Nothing, Dad," he said finally. "Just tired." Edward frowned but didn't press further. He patted James on the shoulder. "All right. But you can talk to me about anything, right?" James nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. Inside, Eleanor watched them from the kitchen window. Her face was calm, but her grip on the dish towel was tight enough to turn her knuckles white. Edward was beginning to interfere, to disrupt the delicate balance she had created. She would need to act soon, before he could undo everything. That night, as thunder rumbled in the distance and lightning illuminated the sky, Eleanor's resolve solidified. She had spent hours on her knees in prayer, begging for clarity, for strength. And as the storm outside grew louder, she believed she had found her answer. "God has chosen us," she whispered to herself, her voice trembling with conviction. Down the hall, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling as the shadows danced across his room. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within him, each crash of thunder echoing the chaos in his mind. He knew something was coming, something terrible. And in the darkness, Eleanor stood in her room, clutching her Bible tightly. She turned to a passage she had read countless times before, her lips moving silently as she recited the words. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, and made her decision. The next step was inevitable. The Harper household, once a place of modest tranquility, had become a pressure cooker of unspoken words, lingering gazes, and mounting suspicion. Each family member carried a weight they could not articulate, James with his growing fear, Edward with his unease, and Eleanor with her unyielding conviction. The storm that had been gathering in their lives was about to break. Edward began arriving home earlier, abandoning the extra shifts he used to take at the Charleston auto shop. Though he couldn't explain why, he felt an urgency to be present. There were moments, fleeting but impossible to ignore, when he sensed something deeply wrong. Eleanor's interactions with James were no longer the innocent displays of maternal love they once seemed. Her smiles lingered too long, her tone softened too much, and her body language carried a tension Edward couldn't place. One evening, Edward arrived home to find Eleanor and James in the kitchen. The air was thick with an unspoken tension that seemed to vibrate in the very walls. Eleanor stood at the counter, slicing vegetables with an intensity that bordered on aggressive. James sat stiffly at the table, staring at a math workbook but not turning a single page. "Evening," Edward said, trying to sound casual as he set his keys on the counter. James barely glanced up. "Hey, Dad." Eleanor turned to face him, her knife still in hand. "You're home early," she remarked, her voice even but lacking the warmth Edward expected. "Figured I'd take a break from the shop," Edward replied. He glanced at James, noting the tension in his son's posture. "Everything okay here?" "Of course," Eleanor said quickly, her smile too bright, too forced. "James and I were just working through his studies. Weren't we, sweetheart?" James nodded, though his expression betrayed him. "Yeah. Homework." Edward didn't press further, but the knot in his stomach tightened. The next day, Edward decided to observe more closely. He began paying attention to the little things he'd once ignored, the way Eleanor hovered near James even during mundane tasks, the way she touched his arm as if reassuring him constantly, and the way James recoiled ever so slightly from her presence. Later that week, Edward came home unexpectedly in the early afternoon, hoping to catch a quiet moment with James. But as he entered the house, he heard Eleanor's voice drifting from the living room. It wasn't her usual sing-song tone, it was low, urgent, and unsettling. "You have to trust me, James," she was saying. "God has chosen us for something extraordinary. Don't you see that?" Edward's heart pounded as he crept closer. He peeked into the living room, where Eleanor sat beside James on the couch, holding his hand tightly. James looked pale, his body stiff, his gaze locked on the floor. "Mom, I don't think," James began, but Eleanor interrupted him, her voice rising. "Don't think. Just have faith," she said, her eyes wide with fervor. "The Bible is clear, James. It's all there if you just open your heart." Edward stepped into the room, his voice sharp and commanding. "What's going on here?" Eleanor flinched, her grip on James loosening slightly. "Edward," she said, recovering quickly, "we were just discussing scripture. You know how important it is to keep James grounded in his faith." James stood abruptly, pulling his hand away. "I'm going to my room," he muttered, brushing past his father without meeting his eyes. Edward watched him go before turning back to Eleanor. "What the hell was that about?" Eleanor's expression hardened, the warmth in her eyes replaced by a steely resolve. "You wouldn't understand," she said coldly. "Try me," Edward shot back. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I'm doing what God has asked of me. I'm protecting our son's soul, Edward. Something you wouldn't know about because you're too busy fixing cars to see what's happening in this world." Edward's jaw tightened. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. James is my son too, and I'm not blind. Something's going on, Eleanor, and I'm going to figure out what it is." Eleanor's smile returned, but it was icy and sharp. "Be careful, Edward," she said softly. "You wouldn't want to interfere with God's work." That night, Edward lay awake long after Eleanor had fallen asleep. Her words echoed in his mind, as did the haunted look in James' eyes. He felt as though he was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring into an abyss he couldn't comprehend. Meanwhile, in his own room, James sat on his bed, his head in his hands. The walls felt like they were closing in, and his mother's voice still rang in his ears. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape. But he couldn't. Down the hall, Eleanor sat in the kitchen, her Bible open in front of her. She flipped through the pages, her lips moving silently as she read. When she finally closed the book, her eyes were alight with determination. She had been tested, and she had endured. Now, it was time to act. The storm that had been brewing for months was about to erupt, and none of them would escape unscathed. The night of August 15, 2022, was suffocatingly hot. The air outside clung to the skin like a heavy blanket, while distant thunder rolled across the South Carolina skies. Inside the Harper home, the tension had reached its zenith. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil brewing within, both promising to shatter the fragile veneer of peace that had kept the family together. Edward had come home early that day, his unease driving him back from Charleston before the sun dipped below the horizon. He parked his truck down the street, his heart pounding with an urgency he couldn't quite explain. Approaching the house, he noticed something strange. The lights were off, except for the faint glow emanating from James' upstairs bedroom. The oppressive silence was broken only by the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. With trembling hands, Edward unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house felt eerily still, as though holding its breath. He paused in the entryway, straining to listen. That's when he heard it, a low murmur of voices coming from upstairs. Climbing the staircase as quietly as possible, Edward's pulse quickened with each step. The voices grew clearer, Eleanor's unmistakable fervent tone and James' muffled protests. Reaching the landing, he saw that James' door was slightly ajar. Peering through the crack, Edward's world tilted. Eleanor stood over James, her hands on his shoulders, her face inches from his. James was seated on the edge of his bed, his head bowed as if trying to disappear. "You have to understand," Eleanor was saying, her voice trembling with emotion. "This is God's will. He's chosen us, James. We're special, don't you see?" "Mom," James said, his voice cracking. Please, just stop. Eleanor leaned closer, her fingers tightening on his shoulders. Don't fight this, sweetheart. This is what he wants for us. This is how we show our devotion. Edward couldn't contain himself any longer. He burst into the room, his voice a mix of rage and disbelief. What the hell is going on here? Eleanor and James both froze, their heads snapping toward the door. For a moment, the three of them stared at each other in stunned silence, the weight of the moment pressing down like the humid air outside. Then chaos erupted. Eleanor stepped forward, her expression shifting from surprise to desperation. Edward, you don't understand, she pleaded, reaching for him. This is God's plan, His will. You have to trust me. Edward recoiled, his face contorted with fury. God's plan? He bellowed. Are you out of your damn mind? He's our son, Eleanor. What the hell have you done? James stood abruptly, his face pale and streaked with tears. Dad, please. But Edward wasn't listening. His focus was locked on Eleanor, who continued to babble about divine intervention and sacred duties. You're sick, Edward spat, his voice trembling with disgust. You've lost your damn mind. Eleanor's face twisted, her desperation giving way to anger. You've never understood, she hissed. You've never had faith, Edward. That's why this is beyond you. You're too blind to see the truth. Edward took a step toward her, his fists clenched. The only thing I see is a woman who's destroyed this family, he growled. The tension snapped like a taut wire. Eleanor lunged at Edward, her hands clawing at his chest. James stepped between them, trying to separate his parents, but the struggle quickly escalated. In the chaos, Edward's hand brushed against James' baseball bat, propped against the wall. Without thinking, he grabbed it, his knuckles turning white as he held it aloft. Get away from me, Eleanor, he warned, his voice low and dangerous. Eleanor didn't listen. You won't ruin this, Edward, she screamed, her voice shrill with fury. You won't stand in the way of God's will. She lunged again, and instinct took over. Edward swung the bat. The sickening crack echoed through the room, louder than the thunder outside. Eleanor crumpled to the floor, her body limp and motionless. Blood pooled beneath her head, dark and viscous, soaking into the carpet. For a moment, time stood still. Edward stared at his wife's body, the bat slipping from his hands. James fell to his knees beside her, his trembling hands hovering over her still form but too afraid to touch her. Mom, James choked out, his voice barely above a whisper. Mom, wake up. Please, wake up. Edward staggered backward, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. What have I done? He muttered, his eyes wide with horror. The storm outside finally broke, rain pounding against the windows as lightning illuminated the room in harsh, fleeting flashes. The three of them had entered that room as a family. Now, only two remained, their lives shattered beyond repair. And in the distance, the sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the storm like a blade. The morning after Eleanor Harper's death, the once quiet town of Briarwood Heights woke to a storm of whispers. Police cruisers with flashing lights painted the Harper home in alternating hues of red and blue, drawing curious neighbors from their porches despite the lingering rain. As the body of Eleanor was wheeled out on a stretcher, covered in a pristine white sheet that hid the horror beneath, the weight of the tragedy began to seep into the fabric of the community. Edward Harper sat in the back of a police cruiser, his hands cuffed and his face a mask of shock. He hadn't resisted when the officers arrived, their questions drowned out by the roar of blood in his ears. His eyes were glassy, locked on the window as the world outside blurred into meaningless shapes. Inside the house, James was inconsolable. Hunched over in the corner of the living room, wrapped in a blanket provided by one of the officers, he sobbed uncontrollably. A paramedic attempted to comfort him, but James barely registered their presence. His mother was gone. His father was gone. The fragile world he'd been trapped in for so long had finally collapsed, leaving only ruin. Detective Lorraine Blackwell from the county sheriff's office was assigned to the case. A seasoned investigator known for her methodical approach, she arrived at the Harper home just as the forensic team began combing through the scene. The air inside the house was heavy, thick with the echoes of what had transpired the night before. The living room was a study in disarray, a baseball bat smeared with blood lay abandoned near the couch, and the carpet in James' bedroom upstairs bore a dark, ominous stain. Detective Blackwell noticed the Bible left open on the kitchen table, its pages marked with passages underlined in furious strokes of ink. This wasn't just a fight, Blackwell muttered to herself as she reviewed the evidence. This was something deeper. As the investigation unfolded, a disturbing narrative began to emerge. Interviews with neighbors and members of the church revealed that Eleanor's behavior in the months leading up to her death had raised quiet concerns. She was always intense, said one neighbor, wringing her hands nervously. I just thought she was a little too religious, you know? But I never imagined, her voice trailed off, unable to finish the thought. At the First Baptist Church, Pastor Theodore Wilkins struggled to address the scandal that now engulfed his congregation. Eleanor was a devout woman, he told Detective Blackwell during his interview. But devout can sometimes blur the line into obsessive. I regret not stepping in sooner. James Harper was taken to Baptist Memorial Hospital in Columbia for a psychological evaluation. For days, he remained in a state of near catatonia, his eyes vacant and his answers to questions monosyllabic. It wasn't until Detective Blackwell visited him that he finally began to speak. I didn't know what to do, James confessed, his voice barely audible. She was my mom. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe it was all for God. James described months of isolation, manipulation, and coercion. Eleanor's constant presence, her twisted interpretations of Scripture, her insistence that they were chosen, it all painted a chilling picture of a woman consumed by her own delusions. Detective Blackwell listened intently, her pen scratching against her notebook as she documented every detail. She knew James was as much a victim in this tragedy as anyone, but his testimony was critical in understanding the full scope of what had happened. 6 months later, on a crisp February morning, the trial of Edward Harper began. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the prosecutor, District Attorney Veronica Prescott, laid out the case. She painted Edward as a man who had lost control, succumbing to a rage so violent it ended in the death of his wife. Whatever her actions, whatever her state of mind, Eleanor Harper did not deserve to die like this, Prescott told the jury, her voice firm and resolute. Edward Harper took her life in a fit of anger, and he must be held accountable. On the defense side, Amelia Roth, a young and ambitious attorney, argued a different narrative. She portrayed Edward as a man pushed to his breaking point by unimaginable circumstances. Eleanor Harper's actions were not those of a stable individual, Roth said, her voice measured but impassioned. This is not a story of cold-blooded murder, it's a tragedy born from years of psychological manipulation and emotional torment. The trial's most gripping moment came when James took the stand. He was visibly gaunt, his eyes hollow as he recounted the events leading up to his mother's death. She controlled everything, he said, his voice shaking. She made me believe things that weren't true. She made me believe I couldn't trust anyone but her. James' testimony was both heartbreaking and damning. It painted a picture of a family trapped in a web of control, delusion, and misplaced faith, with Edward caught in the crossfire. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. The atmosphere in the courtroom was electric as the foreman rose to deliver the verdict. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Edward Harper, not guilty, she announced. A collective gasp rippled through the room. But she wasn't finished. On the charge of voluntary manslaughter, we find the defendant guilty. Edward Harper was sentenced to 12 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 8. As the judge handed down the sentence, Edward's shoulders slumped. He had prepared himself for this outcome, but the weight of the reality still crushed him. As Edward was led away in handcuffs, he turned to look at James one last time. Their eyes met, and in that fleeting moment, a lifetime of pain, love, and regret passed between them. The trial left Briarwood Heights reeling. The Harper home was abandoned, its windows dark and lifeless, a ghostly reminder of the family that had once lived there. At the First Baptist Church, pews emptied as congregants struggled to reconcile the tragedy with their faith. For Detective Blackwell, the case was one she would never forget. As she closed her file, she couldn't shake the feeling that there were no winners in this story, only victims, forever scarred by the choices and circumstances that had led to that fateful night. And for James, the journey to heal was only just beginning. The echoes of that tragic night continued to ripple through Briarwood Heights long after the courtroom emptied and the media frenzy subsided. The Harper family's downfall became a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones among neighbors and discussed with solemn reverence during Sunday sermons. But for those who lived it, the journey toward healing had only begun. James moved to Charleston shortly after the trial, living with his aunt, a woman whose warmth and steady presence stood in stark contrast to the oppressive atmosphere he'd known growing up. The first few weeks were the hardest. Every corner of his new room seemed haunted by memories of his mother's voice, her twisted interpretation of love, and the unbearable weight of her expectations. Therapy became a lifeline for James, offering him a space to untangle the web of manipulation and guilt that Eleanor had woven around him. His therapist, a kind but firm woman named Dr. Mason, helped him confront the reality of his mother's actions and their impact on his life. "She was your mother, James," Dr. Mason told him during one session, "but that doesn't mean she was right. Love is not control. Faith is not fear." Over time, James began to reclaim pieces of himself that he'd long buried. He returned to school, though the thought of making friends still felt daunting. Books became his refuge again, not as an escape but as a way to rebuild the world around him. On quiet nights, James would sit on the porch of his aunt's home, staring at the stars and wondering if forgiveness, for his mother, for his father, and for himself, was possible. He didn't have the answer yet, but he held on to the hope that one day he might find it. Edward Harper's life at Lee Correctional Institution was a stark contrast to the family life he'd worked so hard to maintain. The monotony of prison life left him with endless hours to reflect on the choices and circumstances that led him there. He filled his time with work in the prison's maintenance department, but it was the letters he wrote to James that gave him a sense of purpose. "I failed you," one letter read. "I should have seen what was happening. I should have stopped it before it came to this. I'll never forgive myself for that, but I hope someday you can." James rarely wrote back, not out of anger but because he didn't yet know what to say. Still, he kept every letter in a small wooden box by his bed, reading them on the days when the weight of his past felt too heavy to carry alone. Back in Briarwood Heights, the town struggled to move on. The Harper home remained empty, its windows dark and its garden overgrown, a ghostly reminder of the tragedy. At First Baptist Church, Pastor Wilkins delivered a sermon one Sunday titled, "Faith Without Love is Nothing." Though he never mentioned the Harpers by name, his message was clear: blind faith, unchecked by compassion and humility, could lead to devastating consequences. The congregation was divided. Some praised the pastor's courage, while others accused him of casting judgment on Eleanor, a woman many still saw as a victim of her own trauma. Attendance at the church dwindled in the months that followed, the community fractured by the questions no one dared to ask aloud: how had they missed the signs? Could they have done something to prevent this? As James stood at his aunt's doorstep one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he realized that his story was far from over. He carried scars, yes, but he also carried the potential to rebuild, to create a life defined not by the darkness he'd endured but by the light he could still find. He whispered a quiet prayer, not to the God his mother had spoken of with such fervor, but to the faint hope that someday, he might find peace. What are your thoughts on this tragic story? Do you think Edward Harper deserved his sentence, or was he also a victim of circumstance? Could the community have done more to intervene in the Harper family struggles? And finally, what lessons can we take from this story about faith, family, and the importance of mental health awareness? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective might help others understand this complex and haunting tale.